Hello, I'm Charles Palermo. I would like to join my colleagues in thanking the organizers and patrons of this event. My paper is going to, like everybody else's, push the time limit a little bit, so I'm going to keep it brief that way and dive right in. I have argued elsewhere that important works of Picasso's so-called blue and rose periods produce ambiguities in their figures that suggest divided agencies or persons only partly capable of agency. And that such ambiguities imply similarly ambiguous readings of those works. And further, that those ambiguities cannot be resolved by iconographical or contextual investigations. Rather, that we must accept that Picasso is the agent who put them there, and that his intention was to force on our attention the dual nature of those personages, of works of art and of ourselves. Hence their dual relation to history. Acts accomplished in the past by their authors are also acts that confound us in the eternal present of their fictional world. In slightly later works, these ambiguous narratives give way to the tension between the two-dimensional design of surfaces and the representation of volume and space that establishes the relation of a cubist work to history, and more specifically, to the kind of history that I will align with modernism, a history in which the objective historical truth of a representation stands over against the equally necessary effort in each beholder's encounter with the work to make sense of the work and to respond to it in the present. To begin at the beginning, Pablo Picasso did not believe in the substance of Roman Catholic doctrine, but he lived in a time and place in which the troubles of the church were a matter of very public record. Moreover, people Picasso admired during the early years of the 20th century, such as Paul Gauguin and Paul Verlaine, and people who were close to Picasso in those years, such as Charles Maurice and Guillaume Apollinaire, were well-versed and deeply interested in the challenges confronting the church. Specifically, the church was faced with a movement which it condemned and named modernism that raised important questions about the practice of interpretation and its relation to history. The background is this. The Enlightenment and modern science made a commitment to a naturalistic view of the world seem almost obvious. This commitment to naturalism put Catholic doctrine on the defensive. Something like a crisis of the church's authority was exacerbated by a growing body of historical biblical criticism, which asked a fundamental question. Was Jesus a historical political leader in an imperial Roman Israel, or a trans-historical figure whose teaching speaks to the ages? Even the church was divided on the answer, and thus confronted a foe within. Those within the church who sought to reconcile its teaching with what they understood to be the challenges of modernity were rejected by a church that grew increasingly critical of accommodating the skeptics. The conflict was intractable because the dilemma at its heart was so thorny. And the crux is this. If Scripture is a historical record, it just tells us what happened, not how we need to live and worship. If, on the other hand, Scripture is a set of teachings for us, its historical truth is of secondary relevance, and its force is very much up to us to determine in the present. Another way to put the problem would be to say that we're interested in a certain action, and we're faced with a choice about where to locate the agency responsible for it. If we locate Scripture's agency outside it, in the historical Jesus, it is one kind of text with one meaning. If we locate Scripture's agency within, because Jesus' agency is and remains immanent in it, then it is another kind of text with a different meaning altogether. This dilemma between historical record on the one hand and presently grasped truth on the other found its way into the artistic discourse around the young Picasso. Perhaps because all works of art produce a similar dilemma. Works of art are historical artifacts, and we know that understanding a work means understanding the motivations that shaped it. But a work of art also aims to elicit responses from us. And yet we are not necessarily clear about the relation between our historical understanding of a work of art and our response to that work. Some of the most popular positions on history and interpretation evade the problem. A certain kind of historicism tells us that no matter how far our knowledge penetrates, our responses can never reach the work's original meaning, the agency that produced it being alien to the text and to our world. A popular presentism tells us that while the work has a form fixed in the historical past, our understanding of it and therefore our response to it happen here and now, speaking to an agency within the work. In practice, it is rare, to say the least, to find such approaches consistently maintained. Practically speaking, we're left with the dilemma. For one of his works, Guillaume Apollinaire borrowed a character who literally embodied the problem by bridging the historical distance between the time of the Gospels and the historical present, the wandering Jew of legend. Or that's the explicit premise of his short story, The Wandering Jew, or Le Passant de Prague. In reality, however, the reader is led to doubt that very premise. The protagonist's interlocutor, who claims to be the wandering Jew, doomed to roam the earth and bear witness to Jesus' divinity until Christ's return, meets the narrator in Prague and explains that he walks incessantly until he suffers one of his periodic malaises, brief interruptions in his itinerary of happy drinking and whoring, from which he rapidly recovers to resume his aimless ramble. After promenading with the narrator protagonist, the man who claims to be the wandering Jew falls critically ill. He is taken to a Jewish home. A Jew from the neighborhood then informs the narrator that a Jew, the wanderer who accompanied the narrator, was about to die. In doing so, and in conformity with custom, the speaker tears his shirt. This reminder of the transience of all earthly things echoes something that happened at the tale's beginning. A bag check clerk at the train station tears a ticket and gives half to the narrator, explaining that with the matching half, the narrator will later be able to prove himself the owner of the checked bag. The fault in the clerk's reasoning is obvious. Possessing half a torn ticket doesn't prove you own the corresponding luggage. It only proves that you have half a ticket. But it is also the fault in the mourning Jew's reasoning. He tears his shirt to bear witness to the imminence of the old man's death, but a torn shirt is no more proof than a torn ticket. If the old man rises again to resume drinking and whoring, then he is, at least still plausibly, the wandering Jew of legend. If he dies, he is not. The story ends before the question, the centrality of which cannot be doubted, could be resolved. If we aim to understand the wanderer's enterprise, we are left wondering whether he was wandering eternally or merely wandering. The truth is determinate in the world of the story. However, we will not learn it. To understand the abrupt ending as the author's act, though, means seeing that Apollinaire leaves the truth of the matter out of the story, which is to say there is no answer, and precisely not to say that there's a fact of the matter that remains forever beyond our reach. Obviously, the temptation to read the story in terms of the wanderer's activity, which centers on the inaccessibility of definitive proof, raises the issue of faith or conviction, which is central to art as it is to religion. Seen as Apollinaire's work, however, it is just a theme of skepticism and faith, played out in a humorous story. This parallels the conundrum of historical biblical criticism and the issue of locating the relevant agency too, inside the work with the wanderer or outside the work with the historical author. Now consider a work of Picasso's, painted nearly at the same time Apollinaire wrote The Wandering Jew, though the two of them did not know one another at the time. Poor People on the Seashore, also known as The Tragedy, is one of Picasso's turn-of-the-century works in which commentators have recognized ambiguously Christian imagery. Seen in such terms, it's a humble, holy family. Perhaps the boy's hieratic gesture is to be read as a gesture of blessing, possibly a reference to Jesus' future ministry. Seen another way, the picture could merely represent some of Picasso's less fortunate contemporaries sharing their misery on a seashore. In that sense, the boy's gesture might better be understood as directed at his male companion. Perhaps the gesture is God's son's way of invoking his heavenly father's blessing. Maybe it is a pauper boy's way of getting his father's attention. Perhaps the familiarity of the latter is why the former is understandable at all. As one of the Catholic modernists, George Terrell, claimed, such parallels are the way divine truth puts itself within reach of the common believer. While the philosophical understanding of the trained theologian approaches the same truths more nearly, but also more abstractly, common understanding uses the familiar to make the incomprehensible available to the believer. On the other hand, as Soren Kierkegaard pointed out decades earlier, any Christian congregation will readily and comfortably accept that Jesus changed water into wine a couple of millennia ago. But tell them you saw such a miracle last week, and they will judge you insane. And yet, if their beliefs are what they think they are, they believe they still live in a world, in the very same world, in which miraculous eruptions of divine power within the natural order are real. Conviction in the world a work embodies is made both easier and more difficult by that world's remoteness from our own. Isn't this just a problem in hermeneutics? Don't all of us who interpret historical works face it? Do we not always use the familiar or recognizable, our experience and intuition of the work, to reach or preserve the world the work seals up in itself? Do we not have to exercise a certain kind of historical imagination to make the situation of authors of historically remote works real for ourselves, to test our conviction in their works? Does every work not produce a division, like those produced by Apollinaire's story and Picasso's painting, between another world and one's own, between a reading that asks questions about an agency in the work and a reading that asks questions about an agency outside it? Obviously, I think so. Furthermore, I think this issue was a very live one for Picasso and a number of his companions and important predecessors. What I've just claimed is that Catholic modernism offers an important historical discursive context for the expression of these concerns in Picasso's so-called Blue Period. And even then, in the first years of the century, as I've explained elsewhere, Picasso used non-religious motifs to work out his interest in the problem. What I want to do here, next, is explain how I see these issues return after the ambiguously Christian imagery of the Blue and Rose periods, the years leading to the crisis of modernism, and nearer Picasso's Cubist years, the flowering of his modernism. Unity and wholeness are traditionally defining features of the work of art, and above all of the easel painting. Think, for instance, of the term tableau, as it has been discussed by Michael Fried. Think also of its upending by Manet and his generation, and their revaluation of the morceau. From within the same context, consider Stéphane Mallarmé's project for Le Livre, a project that combines an insistence on total authorial control with the loss of or clear rejection of formal closure, and with closure, a rejection of formal unity. Such a work introduces a sharp split between the objective being of the work, the expression of authorial control, and the reader's experience, which will necessarily be partial and contingent. Apollinaire's story and Picasso's painting are meant to insist on the importance in them of foregrounding that distinction. Often, this distinction is taken to mark a transition, both historical and somehow ontological, from a regime of artistic production that insists that every work has a fixed meaning to a regime that permits or requires the reader or beholder to generate a meaning for the text, which we have come to understand as a difference between asking ourselves about an agent in the text and asking ourselves about an agent outside the text, which is also the tension I have already described between the task of understanding the objective historical meaning of the work and gauging one's response to the work, testing one's conviction in it. Thus, while the hermeneutic issue raised by modernism, both the artistic and Catholic kinds, is inherent in representation, Picasso's and Apollinaire's responses to it are historically conditioned by their responses to both modernisms. The relevant historical conditions start to look and feel very different as Picasso and his work move toward and into Cubism. For one thing, the narrative or dramatic component of them virtually disappears, taking away with it the possibility of the species of ambiguity we noted in the group on the seashore. This would be understandable as a move away from literary content, a move that has been traced very carefully in the artistic discourse immediately before and throughout Cubism's run by Linda Goddard, most notably. Perhaps then, more than one critic compared Picasso's Cubism to Mallarmé's elliptical syntax, One of them, Ardengo Soffici, captured their shared ability, these are Goddard's words, to set up nuanced multiple readings. Thus, the issue we began with, ambiguity as reflexive references to hermeneutic issues in interpretation and response, migrates from Picasso's literary works of the Blue and Rose periods to Cubism. To appreciate a little what this means for the appraisal of Picasso's art in Cubism's heyday, to help us therefore to think our way into what we see, I propose to note quickly a few points about pertinent remarks by Roger Fry, who showed works by Picasso in his post-impressionist shows. There are a couple of reasons for choosing Fry. First, he exemplified this transition, turning early in his career away from narrative or drama as support for aesthetic judgment, and taking in their place formal unity and necessity to be the foundations of painting success. Formal unity, in which conviction rests on the logic of the internal relation of parts, replaces the psychological motivation of persons and their expressive gestures and faces. Moreover, he also discussed this turning in several essays, in his fascinating book on Cézanne and in his remarks on Picasso. In that context, a new reliance on still life, and however briefly landscape, in Picasso's work of 1908 and 1909 makes a lot of sense. Still life does not ordinarily tempt us to consider the relation between sacred history and the everyday, and yet it opens the same division between the work as a literal object we aim to interpret and the work as a fictional world by which we feel more or less compelled and to which we find ourselves more or less compelled to respond. For Fry, this expressed itself as a tension between the representation of ideated or fictional space in the picture on the one hand and surface design on the other, which is another tension Goddard's work has shown at play around Picasso as he made these works. This then, as Fry put it in a late lecture, is the real problem of painting. How is one to represent the outside world in such a way that it enters completely into the pictorial unity? So our ability to make sense of a still life like this one depends on our ability to make sense of the relation of its parts as parts of a fictional world on one hand and on the other of a two-dimensional design. While Fry mentioned Picasso's work on numerous occasions, and there is more to be said about his remarks, he typically and somewhat strangely insisted that it was abstract. Sometimes this is put in terms that leave some resemblance intact, but invoke a new vision. Sometimes the claim is more categorical, such as Fry's assertion that a painting he identifies as le verre d'absinthe, which you're looking at now, is, and these are his words, more or less purely painting in the sense that as there is no recognizable object, we cannot look for associated ideas. Just interlocking shapes that suggest, again Fry, an idea of reciprocal movements as if the planes were interlocking. The space, Fry concludes, is necessarily very limited, for a flat canvas cannot give the idea of volume and space without the representation of more or less natural objects. In a little piece entitled Picasso of 1921, Fry suggested that experimentation with contrast of what he called matière imbued a certain plastic quality into Picasso's cubist works, but never much more than in a high-relief sculpture. The tension that drove Fry's non-literary idea of painting then derived from the relation between the two-dimensional design of a painting and the minimal volume and space it could produce. This is why it matters that Fry, quite implausibly, denied the presence of a recognizable object in such work. For him, the kinds of ambiguities that made the difference between the two possible interpretations of the literary subject's return in later, less, as it were, literary works, in the form of ambiguities in the relationship between design and volumes. Now, I in no way want it to be assumed that I rely, in my view of Cubism, on the analysis of Roger Fry. I care only that he can suggest for us what was at stake for a painter of Picasso's intelligence and of his generation, moving in the space of a very few years from making works in the early 20th century French artistic discourse, from making works the early 20th century French artistic discourse could have come to see as literary, to making works structured to such a great degree by tensions between the two-dimensional design of the surface and the evocation of three-dimensional volumes. and I think he's right about that. Consider a work of this transitional period, during which Picasso began painting landscapes and still lifes regularly. Okay, we're getting close. The Museum of Modern Art's landscape of late summer 1908. A tracery of branches forking from the centered tree trunk joins with distant trees, arises that create the ground and the features of a small house to divide the surface of the painting. A gap among several boughs of the near tree frames a distant piece of green vegetation, neatly recalling, at least for me, certain motifs in Cézanne's work, especially his bather paintings, where coincidences of contours in the near ground and the distance all but imply their physical interaction. In fact, although I won't insist on it, the shape of the green foliage recalls the head and upward stretching elbow of a recurring figure in Cézanne's bather paintings, and also of Picasso's own recent Demoiselle d'Avignon. I'm referring, of course, to the figure of the bather with the upstretched elbow. Picasso frames the object in a way that produces a similar sense of the framing motif's responsiveness to the framed motif. Not just where the tree frames the distant foliage, but, for instance, in the roofline, which seems to be extended in the curve of one of the tree's branches and interrupted by another toward the left, near the upper framing edge of the painting. The little twig at left is just thick enough and placed precisely where it would need to be to create a suggestive ambiguity between a roofline that continues its diagonal course all the way to the upper edge of the painting, on one hand, and on the other hand, a discontinuity in that roofline that suggests that the gray quadrilateral on its left rises up straight, parallel to the picture plane, so that the roof does not securely or completely bound a volume, as one supposes a roof should. Something similar takes place, perhaps even more dramatically, around the building's doorway. The thick bough that forms the left side of the gray quadrilateral descends to another, which turns inward to join the left side of the tree's trunk. The more or less vertical part of the bough obscures not only part of the roof's geometry, but part of the near edge of the building, making its volume less clear. The diagonal part of the bough intersects the left edge of the doorway, so that the left-hand edge of the doorway cannot exactly be understood to descend plumb to the bottom of the wall the way the right-hand side does. The wall seems to impinge on the space of the doorway, narrowing it. On the other hand, a twig that springs from the edge of the diagonal segment of the limb covers up, or one might be tempted to say produces, the opposite effect, making it seem that the continuity of the doorway's left edge is interrupted, but so as to widen it. I just realized I have a pointer. You see what I'm referring to there? There is a conflict here between the design on the surface of the painting and implied volumes in the fictional space of the painted landscape that produces unresolvable ambiguities, and also the impression of an intelligence or agency that produces the coincidences of the branches and twigs on the one hand, and the contours that define the volume of the house on the other. Or the branches and the humanoid foliage they frame. That agency, which we know in fact to be Picasso's, is represented as belonging to the tree, in something like the way Mallarmé's elliptical syntax makes multiple possible meanings appear to hide within language's own opacity. This thematization of the openness of representation to different readings, at least when agency is transferred imaginatively from the author to the representation's syntax, replaces the literary ambiguity of Picasso's and Apollinaire's earlier symbolist-influenced work. But the point remains the same. Just like the Catholic variety, artistic modernism forces on the reader or beholder an awareness of the difference between the agency that gave form to the work and the apparent agency within that form to which the audience feels its response to be directed. Thank you.